On our broadcast tonight, making a deal to cut the number of nuclear weapons. Can President Obama take the chill out of relations with Russia? State of transition as she walks away from the governor's job. Big questions remain. Why did she do it? And what's next for Sarah Palin? Drawing a crowd. Last-minute preparations for Michael Jackson's massive memorial. Reports of upwards of 1 million people showing up while the whole world will be watching. And the architect of America's long and costly war in Vietnam. Tonight, remembering Robert S. McNamara. Nightly News begins now.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. We've come a good long way since the Cold War, but relations with the Russians have been downright chilly for a good number of years. Tonight, the President of the United States is in Russia, and when those two leaders talk, the whole world has a stake in it. As Time magazine put it this week, between them, let's not forget they own enough firepower to blow us all to kingdom come. They talked about that firepower today as a new U.S. president now gets to deal with the Russians. It's where we begin tonight. Our chief White House correspondent, Chuck Todd, traveling with the president in Moscow. Chuck, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. Well, it was a very busy first day in Moscow for President Obama because, in the words of the Russian president, the two were dealing with a backlog of problems. Those problems include that nuclear proliferation issue you were talking about, Iran, even U.S. beef exports. Flying all night, the president arrived in Moscow early Monday with his entire family in tow. Unlike his previous overseas trips, the pomp and circumstance was kept to a minimum by his host, Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, a subtle reminder the two Cold War adversaries were in danger of falling back into old habits.
The president and I agreed that the relationship between Russia and the United States has suffered from a sense of drift. We resolved to reset U.S.-Russian relations so that we can cooperate more effectively in areas of common interest.
The areas of common interest? Nuclear arms reduction and the war in Afghanistan. The major achievement of the day, a framework for a new nuclear arms treaty to be hammered out by year's end. It includes a reduction of nuclear warheads from the current limit of 2,200 to a new lower range between 1,500 and 1,675, and eliminating as many as 1/3 of the two countries' long-range missiles capable of carrying those warheads from 1,600 to between 500 and 1,100. As for Afghanistan, the U.S. military can now use Russian airspace to move supplies and troops in and out of the country. But those were the easy topics.
As President Medvedev indicated, we've had some frank discussions, and there are areas where we still disagree.
Most notably, an American plan for expanding missile defense near the Russian border.
President Medvedev has been very clear that this is a point of deep concern and sensitivity to the Russian government.
Our understanding is that these decisions do concern us, and we will have to come to terms on these positions.
The Russian president took pains not to mention Iran by name today, simply referring to nuclear issues in the Middle East. But as Mr. Obama's top Russia advisor put it, the U.S. is receiving indications the Russians want to cooperate on Iran.
If they wanted to have an adversarial relationship with us, with Iran right now, there are all kinds of things they could do very easily that would make our situation a lot worse there, and they're not doing those things.
Another reason for U.S. optimism, the personal chemistry between the two leaders. Harkening back to the trust but verify days of the Cold War, a wary Mr. Obama said he trusted Medvedev, to a point.
President Medvedev and I are committed to leaving behind the suspicion and the rivalry of the past so that we can advance the interests that we hold in common.
Now, Brian, tomorrow the president meets with Prime Minister Vladimir Putin. Now, today the president was quite nimble in trying to deal with a question of whether Medvedev or Putin really holds the power here. He said, quote, "My strong impression is that President Medvedev and Prime Minister Putin are working very effectively together." I think he'll get a first-hand look about Putin tomorrow, Brian.
All right, Chuck Todd at the meeting of these two leaders in Moscow tonight. Thanks. We'll have more on just who is in charge in Russia these days a bit later on in this broadcast tonight. Now to domestic politics and the bombshell from Alaska. Governor Sarah Palin's announcement. She's quitting her job, getting out of the game, but why and then what? Our own Andrea Mitchell is in Wasilla, Alaska tonight with more on that story. Andrea, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. After widespread criticism in political circles of that surprising announcement, Sarah Palin is fighting back today through friends and advisors and tweets. With some of the Palin family at the lake house in Wasilla, Sarah Palin went on Twitter to say she and husband Todd had gone fishing at a commercial fishing site in western Alaska on Bristol Bay. She wrote, "Grateful Todd left fishing grounds to join me this weekend, but now he's back slaying salmon and working the kids at the site, anxious to join him." As she has in the past, Palin was picking fish, but the political world is still picking over that resignation speech.
It would be apathetic to just kind of hunker down and go with the flow. We're fishermen. We know that only dead fish go with the flow.
Watching Sarah Palin is sort of like watching a moose on roller skates. It's never particularly graceful, but it's always riveting, and certainly we can put this in that category.
Today, her advisors rallied. A friend of 40 years from grade school, Kristen Cole, now overseeing Palin's legal defense fund.
I think she really feels at peace about it. She feels good. She feels like it was the right decision for the right reasons.
Palin's lawyer, who denies any scandal yet to come, and got the FBI to say she is not under federal investigation, as some blogs have claimed.
There are no legal shoes to drop. We are aware of nothing going on that could compel the decision of the governor to resign.
He says she's accomplished everything she wanted to in Alaska. But since returning from last year's national campaign, Palin has lost battle after battle with the state legislature. Some hometown supporters, like John and Dale Reed, wish she had stayed to finish the job.
She's letting us down by quitting midterm.
To that, Palin political advisor Megan Stapleton says,
I've heard that too, that others calling her a quitter, when it's actually quite the opposite. She's just taking her fight elsewhere.
Taking her fight elsewhere could make Palin a very rich woman indeed, with her book deal, with speeches, possibly a talk show. It's a long way from Wasilla. Brian?
Andrea Mitchell in Wasilla, Alaska for us tonight. Andrea, thanks for your reporting. Now we go to Southern California and the elaborate preparations for tomorrow's elaborate memorial for Michael Jackson. A report that upwards of 1 million people might show up put everyone on notice today. Our own Lee Cowan is at the Staples Center in L.A. with more tonight. Lee, good evening.
Well, good evening, Brian. Yeah, this is an event unlike anything the LAPD or really any other agency has had to deal with here. And the fear, which is a very real one, is that now that LA is the epicenter for what's really become worldwide grief over Michael Jackson, no one is really sure how all of this is going to play out tomorrow.
But they told me.
Never has a drive-through offered this kind of excitement.
Oh my God, I couldn't believe it.
Without ever leaving their cars, thousands of Jackson faithful picked up their tickets to tomorrow's star-studded goodbye. One the Jackson family says could include Stevie Wonder, Smokey Robinson, and Jennifer Hudson, just to name a few.
I felt like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, golden ticket.
For real Jackson fans, money is no object, whether they drove from near or flew from far.
If you can watch from heaven, you'll see all these people loved him. That's what I want.
The problem? More than 1.5 million fans who registered for tickets were told they didn't get one. And that's what has the LAPD pulling out all the stops.
This is 21st century policing at its finest.
In an underground bunker below City Hall, officers will be monitoring every angle from above.
It is literally impossible to do anything without us seeing you.
But despite police warnings, many who want to pay their respects to Michael Jackson say they came too fast and too far to sit on the sidelines.
I'm coming with or without tickets.
It's a circus no matter how you look at it, and the wall-to-wall TV coverage of Jackson's death has prompted outrage. New York Congressman Peter King posted a video on YouTube blasting the media for often forgetting Jackson's troubled past.
This guy was a pervert, he was a child molester, he was a pedophile.
Words he later defended.
To get people's attention, I wanted to use everyday language, the way people talk, and the way I believe a lot of people really feel.
Debbie Rowe, Jackson's former wife, had some pointed words for the media, too.
Do not touch me!
She's been hounded since Jackson's death and now says she's not attending Jackson's memorial because she fears she'd be a distraction. Now, amid all of this is more debate over Jackson's will. Today, a judge ruled that Jackson's longtime attorney, as well as a family friend, will take over the $500 million estate. That's taking it away from Jackson's mother, Catherine. But all of this is to be discussed again at a court hearing at the beginning of next month. Brian.
Lee Cowan on the eve of the big event in L.A. tonight. Lee, thanks. And a program note here, we'll have live coverage of the memorial for Michael Jackson tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific time here on NBC. This was a deadly day for U.S. forces in Afghanistan. 7 deaths in all, including 4 killed in a roadside bomb attack on U.S. military trainers in the northern part of Afghanistan. 2 killed in another attack in the south. 1 more who died after a firefight in the eastern region of the country. It was the worst one-day toll in almost a year of fighting. And it was a violent day in China, where authorities continue a brutal crackdown on ethnic unrest that has exploded into rioting and bloodshed, as you'll see, over the past 2 days. China's own news agency says more than 150 people are dead, hundreds more injured. Our own Ian Williams is in China, where he filed this report.
The deadly clashes were shown on state television. Muslim minority Uyghurs riot.
There are reports of clashes in another city and of rising tension right across that region. Ian Williams, NBC News, Beijing.
When we continue this Monday night, more on the summit in Moscow and the lingering questions about who's really in charge in Russia these days. And later, McNamara, a look back at the name and the man forever associated with Vietnam. We're back here tonight with NBC News In Depth. The meeting in Moscow today between President Obama and President Medvedev, was it truly a meeting of equals? There is another power center there, has been for years, not as visible today, the Prime Minister Vladimir Putin. He meets with Obama in the morning. Our report from Moscow tonight from NBC's Jim Maceda.
Over the past decade, Vladimir Putin's morphed into more roles than a Hollywood star. From President Boris Yeltsin's shy, obedient yes man to the imperious leader, the action man, bomber pilot, artist, and lately the people's prime minister, combating Russia's deep recession hand to hand, harassing a supermarket manager for marking up pork prices. They're very high, said Putin. It'll be lower tomorrow, was the quick reply. And this showdown at a cement factory near St. Petersburg. When orders dried up, managers shut the plant, laying off hundreds. Until Putin shamed the bosses, even tossing a pen and ordering one of them to sign a promise to rehire every worker. Now other towns are hoping for some of Putin's special attention, like Likhina, outside Moscow, once known for the factory that builds Russian buses. Recently, more than half of the plant's 3,500 workers were fired. Nothing will change here unless Putin comes, he says. He can smack them on the head, then they'll rethink things. What's behind the populism? Some think Putin's already campaigning for the 2012 presidential election.
His message to the people is don't forget about me. And not only don't forget about me, but still believe in me as a savior.
And while Medvedev gets more of the international spotlight these days, anyone who deals with Russia knows the pecking order.
We're negotiating with a leadership. The senior person in that leadership is Putin.
Vladimir Putin seems to exert the same power and flair here from his offices at the so-called White House as he did here at his old address just a couple of miles down the Moscow River at the Kremlin. Putin watchers say he's pleased with the new arrangement, where Medvedev can hobnob with influential leaders while he pulls all of the levers behind the scenes. Jim Maceda, NBC News, Moscow.
When we continue in just a moment, a former comedian getting serious. Mr. Franken goes to Washington.
Nightly.msnbc.com.
Police in Nashville say former NFL MVP Steve McNair's 20-year-old girlfriend bought the handgun that was used in his shooting death Saturday. Officials say Sahel Kazemi, a waitress who met McNair 6 months ago, bought the gun Thursday night. McNair died after being shot 4 times. Kazemi died of 1 gunshot wound, but police are waiting for ballistics testing and results of other tests before ruling her death a murder or a suicide. Smithfield Foods, one of the nation's largest pork producers, says it will shift work to another plant after a major fire damaged a packing plant outside Milwaukee. 2,000 people work at the plant, but few of them were there when the fire started last night. No injuries were reported. It's a local landmark. 100 firefighters have been battling the fire, which has been burning for more than 18 hours. It's now Senator Frank NDU with a tour of his new Senate office building today and a meeting with the leadership. Al Franken's 6-year tour in the U.S. Senate from Minnesota is set to begin officially tomorrow when he is sworn in. The arrival of the comedian-turned-politician gives the Democrats a 60-vote so-called supermajority. When we come back, remembering the longest-serving and most controversial Secretary of Defense in American history. Late word tonight that South Carolina law enforcement officials are saying that a burglary suspect shot and killed early this morning is the serial killer in that region, suspected of 5 murders. Police in Gastonia, North Carolina, about 30 miles from the slaying, shot and killed a man trying to break into a house overnight. He had arrived there in a champagne-colored Ford SUV, the same make and color vehicle linked to the murders. Tonight, authorities confirm the man shot last night is, they say, the suspected killer who has terrified the residents of rural Cherokee County in recent days. Word arrived this morning that Robert McNamara has died. It is difficult to this day to find someone who came up during the 1960s who doesn't have an opinion about him. McNamara died knowing a lot of that was negative, despite his attempts to salvage his reputation. His name will always be associated with one place, Vietnam.
Human beings make many, many mistakes in war.
John F. Kennedy called him the smartest man he ever met. LBJ said he was brilliant. Robert Strange McNamara was one of the so-called whiz kids, the intellectuals of the World War II era. A product of Harvard Business School, he was an accounting professor. He ran the Ford Motor Company. Then at age 44, he became Kennedy's Secretary of Defense.
I have asked Robert McNamara to assume the responsibilities of Secretary of Defense.
He was in on the planning of the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, a disaster for Kennedy early in his presidency. Then came Vietnam. Viewers got to see McNamara as an old man, his famously slick-back hair now thinning, his voice reedy, his level of regret not always easy to pin down.
A lot of people misunderstand the war, misunderstand me. A lot of people think I'm a son of a...
People were amazed to learn years later that the McNamara family offered housing to several young people who came to Washington to protest at the height of the Vietnam War. They slept in sleeping bags in the McNamara living room. One of the McNamara kids was among the protesters, even though Dad was an architect of the war. It was a fairly well-kept secret back then, one of many in the life of Robert McNamara, dead tonight at 93. That is our broadcast for this Monday evening as we start a new week. Thank you for being with us. I'm Brian Williams. We hope to see you tomorrow evening. Good night.